The 10th and last title in this series of modern masters is the Heydar Aliyev Cultural Center in Baku, Azerbaijan, designed by an Iraqi-British architect, Zaha Hadid, and noted for its distinctive architecture and flowing curve style. As you can see here in the model, it seems like one piece of material that keeps a continuity through it, through plaza to structure to space definition, and then floating through 3D space on the powers of zeros and ones. It's named after Heydar Aliyev, the first secretary of the Soviet Azerbaijan from 1969 to 1982. Hadid, in her structure at the time, was already known as one of the major internationally recognized figures in design and architecture, known for unique geometric designs. The British Guardian referred to her as the Queen of the Curve. She was appointed the design architect in 2007 after a series of other major competitions brought her notoriety. So all parts of the building we're going to draw today in watercolor are represented by folds in a single continuous surface. The concrete structure is a spatial structural system with polyester reinforced fiberglass, and the formworks with steel molds where the main concrete was used in its construction. So our viewpoint will be from the plaza side over here as the building wraps down to grade and then becomes the plane for the public square out front. So that's what we'll be seeing. You've transferred that to your watercolor paper now. And so this is when watercolor does its finest. We're just trying to undulate shapes and forms, much like the cloud-like structures we'll do later on in the backdrop. So we'll first do a series of washes with trying to articulate, since it's a white building, where the shading patterns are. So we'll follow left through white with a base here to kind of give ourselves a logic for the composition. So the first thing I want to do is wash some nice blue-black with a hint of green in it shading. Maybe there's some residual from your pools from before, maybe that to make some new. I'll probably add to my base here from the prior sketch. And I'll make sure I have enough to do all the strong values that contrast with the brilliant white concrete in the sun. So it will go to almost dark by the time we're done. In the beginning, it's just sort of a placeholder to guide our composition of light, shade, and shadow. And we'll make it more bountiful with water so that we don't get too strong immediately as we build up our values over time. It's difficult to retreat once the pigment is dried in the paper. And so once you test the value you like, we'll start on the left side and assign the underside not receiving light and shade the whole way, which will be the structure, which is identified as the form making for the architecture here, all complete and unified. And we'll gradate that later because it's going to want to move. If we have something that appears photographically you see monolithic, we're going to move that with value changes along the way as our competition builds. And then what's kind of tricky is as it folds under itself, peaks up at the top of this sort of parabolic arch and comes down and it curls underneath. You see the same white concrete then go from light to shade as it wraps down at this fold. And then dies into the movement of a secondary fold coming from the plane over here to create one of the larger spaces, and that folds out to the plaza itself. That'll be our placeholder for that base here. And now we're going to do first, instead of going directly to the form, we're going to go to the void. So to have natural light pervade the space, it'll come in between the folds themselves as they break out into 4 quadrants here, 4 zones of movement, and opens up in terms of letting natural light bounce in through glazing through these strips. So those will be very dark because they're interior. And we can see in what you traced so far, there's 1, 2, and 3 zones here that come to a point. The rest are line work that's going to trail back to the roof itself, but these are going to come to a linear point and they open up here. So we can find those with a cap to their movement and do a darker value there to start with. And that'll come down to grade here. And then when it meets the plaza, it sort of pours out and becomes the start of sort of a skin of dark to show the stairs making their way up toward an amphitheater type place towards the back. And the next one is a little bit further on. Starting at the top here between the actual structural elements and creating that chasm that slips in between the forms as it opens up. And that too then will come down to grade and be part of a movement of verticality in the walkway up over here. And then one more time over here. And it's going to have a critical piece, which is unique from the first two, is that it bows away. We actually can see into the space, and so it's dark. But we're not going to complete it all the way to the edge. We're going to leave it page white. Because what happens, as you see in the photograph, it moves from the interior being dark, because it can't compete with the light of the sun, but then it's going to go through the space to the void and the sky and the backdrop. So we need that little bit of white left here. And eventually we'll put a tone in here so that ends up being bright in the actual skin out top here. And that'll come towards the end of the sketch as we build out our tones and go from 20% to 90. And again, once again, when it comes down to the grade, we see the frontispiece of another large step in this very discrete type of minimal amphitheater over to the right in the plaza. And now, because the sun is moving probably directly behind us, the throw of the box-like architecture that projects out at this end is simply in shade behind it. So we can come to these places and just zone those out as a tone different than the brilliant white for the rest of the space. Take that right to the edge there. So that's primary, where we're seeing the boldest tones for now. Now we're going to go back in and do some secondary movements. So within the whites themselves, right now, if we don't treat the whites, they're going to be planarly flat. Even though the curves are moving some motion for us, it still reads as a vertical form. So we want to treat it where it's going to have edges that are going to float. So if the sun is perpendicular to this and striking down on that, that would mean that the space that runs from the tip here all the way to the back is actually collapsing white into more of a gray tone at the top. So we'll make this a little bit more water-based, but there will be a little bit of ribbon of dark right at the top here as it goes up to the crown and then makes its way over to the actual shade side we don't see. And that's important then to draw down so it's not a line, it just sort of washes out to the brilliance of the side. So we just use water now to thin that out and bring it back to our point here. And we'll come back in and probably treat that edge a little bit stronger as we move about. Same is true over here. This one is a similar type of form on this end, but it pinches down and makes it tighter and tighter where there's more volume getting pinched into a smaller area that we see from our sight line. So it ends up being a little bit darker at the base here, and then works its way out to its back crown, which is receiving less direct light. And it'll be a nice dark against the blue of the sky we'll paint in later. And again, to have that drift off instead of just being a line, we'll use the play of just water itself and make sure you're drawing from a clear pool of water here. Make that kind of blur out. and hold that edge. Now we come back to our three key areas here of the interiority. What's going to happen is the value of the architecture is cloaking the idea of a cast shadow like this one turned under itself. This is turning and going deep in and then coming back out. So it's not coming straight down. It comes to a brim and then goes back inside. So right at the crux where this makes its turn, there's going to be a value that floats out and then dissipates when it comes to more direct sunlight. So all the way over to this area, this initial curve has got a play of light. And then right when it hits this zone at the base of that and turns towards us, that's where the brilliance of the white hits it again. So it kind of holds its shadow to this point, and we want that to dissipate out to become part of the rest of the concrete formwork. Remain white. And that's how we're kind of trying to play the volume to move towards us geometrically off the paper by giving light, shade, and shadow to it. So now this one's more pronounced because it's a little bit deeper in terms of our view shed for it. So this is going to come from our initial zone and walk out a little bit further on, and then comes to a point, the grade, and then curls back, and again ties into that stepping tiered shallow amphitheater. And finally, the same thing happens over here on the right, where this one comes down and kicks out again to two more of those sensuous curves. And now, because we're actually moving further away from us, the brilliance of it's going to be sort of the highlight of this third of it. As this details away, we don't want this to have the same powerful white as the rest. So we're going to take that same skin and we're going to make sure the underside of this is a little bit grayed out, and we'll go back and gray this out further to create a contrast. But this becomes, in a sense, less important to us because it doesn't have the same brilliance. So we'll come over on this side and show that effect. I'm back with a little bit of water and some language of that movement. You can see I kind of drew in a little bit of that crowning point of where the peak of the white is here. So underneath that, it goes a little bit grayer until it washes down and then finds its brilliance of the white again. So to go from the brilliant white right at this ribbon where it's going to be a peak and almost perpendicular to the sun itself, then the skin washes away and is less of on point with the sun. So actually, as that feeds back into this volume, you can see up here, it almost creates a dark line against the white in the back, even though it's the same material. So we have to push that edge now all the way across the top here against the sky. Make it a little more medium in there, at least for a place setter for now. We'll come back to it as well. And again, just wash that out with a little bit of water so it blends more until we have a final aspect of this high point of white on the structure that faces us. And this high point, which faces us directly too. So the hottest spots of white will be in the center of this and that lip of the undulating curves that's closest to us in space. Now we'll go back from left to right, back in our interior spaces, and we'll see some of the orthogonal things that are set inside to give more information in and around the different exhibits and the functions on the inside. Because inside the 100-seat, the complex comprises a 1,000-seat auditorium, gallery hall, conference hall, museum, a library, and then temporary exhibition spaces. So they'll have workshops and cultural events are always held at the center. So to make those perform, sometimes they do have orthographic box-like spaces in the interior. And so we'll see the edge of those come down here in the front. And they're all in shade, so they're going to drop down. And because they're all in the interior, most everything now beneath this sort of canvas here is going to be dark, receiving no light, and yet we'll see a little bit of a lip of light coming through that's bouncing through the space and kind of gives us a little bit of a lip of light through the space here and here. So it's always important, if you got a chance, if it's glazed, to show the foreground before we get to the building, go inside the building proper itself, and then make sure you make your way all the way to spaces beyond it by leaving areas that are brilliant on the other side of the building too. So that attracts the eye even further. So the inside space then will have, the floor will have a dark line to it, and then finally fit another space back here. But we'll see then this white area back there, which is actually on the other side of the building. So this will come down and be the floor plane, which is all cast in shadow. We'll bring some darker lights in there. But you want, even though it's like a ½ inch or quarter inch here, you still have to animate that detail and take care of, be sort of very architectonic about it, because that's what's explaining the building to your viewer, those types of little details there. And now we can come in very quickly and do some type of tone work here. It's going to be a very white concrete for the building. When it comes down to play here, it tones out because it will be much more difficult to maintain if it was sheer white. So the plane's got more of a tone to it in the foreground. So we can make kind of a sloppy one with the big brush of our same type of shadow, but make it almost all water to start with. And then draw it back in these planes. Don't do a wash across because you want the planes to read kind of individual. So we'll have one walkway start here and then come back towards us. And just let it dissipate out towards the front here. And we'll come back and go to the third one now, so they don't necessarily bleed into each other, but we'll come to that edge where that line came down earlier and just wash that out to the front. So the building's opening up and pouring out. And then probably switch brushes because it's getting thinner and thinner. The spaces go back sort of very quickly. So we'll have this one come down and wash out. And these will come down and create a deeper plane. So it's the same tone now we're seeing marching back because we're seeing more and more space and less actual area in our drawing. Those tones will condense and become darker. So it's the same off-white or gray-white that marches back that becomes more delineated in terms of value. And there's a little bit of a movement right here where it shows our vanishing point right to our horizon line, which is probably right about here. And there's not much projecting back along that line. The point does exist there. So one of the walkways that ends up close to another area, the zone, the exhibition area, actually moves out this way for the first time. Everything's rushing back to the point here. This one's on the other side of the point. And so this will be a nice framework over here to have a darker value on this side to kind of end the sketch. A lot of these lines are just simply washing off in perspective, and it creates the dynamic of having 2 dimensions meet 3. So we're going to kind of end the view here with a darker tone of another surface, which changes when you get past this walkway. We'll just sort of end the sketch with that there and not worry about pulling it down too far. And that creates kind of a stopping point in terms of the composition. We'll go in the distance, and for now, we'll add a little bit of green to it because it's some vegetation, probably a quarter mile away. So with the blue-green, we'll come back here and just sort of denote that for now as being part of the distant information. So again, it takes us from the light to the dark to the light and kind of moves us in space going back. Like you splashed off the brush really quick, so eliminate that with some water there. Okay, we'll let that set up and dry because we want to go in there and control some of the details later on with a more of a drier wash. So in the meantime, we'll go and we'll work with the sky. So the way we're going to do the sky this time is to make it kind of ethereal, but have some sense of the clouds moving through it too. So what we're going to do is we're going to push a wash of just water all the way around to this edge here, so that when the water stops, that's where our pigment will end. So with, again, fresh water here, even if it's just a shade of blue, we're simply going to sort of very quickly wash across here. It doesn't have to be a deep wash because we're going to work quickly. You don't want it to pond up too much. And just move that across in broad strokes as fast as you can. Nice and horizontal. Now you're going to have to work around the shapes because, again, we don't want the architecture to get water now, just the sky area. And I will take the pigment down and work it up to that edge. And so now, without having to draft something in, it's going to stop wherever the water stops. Come down here, you can pull some of the water that's still on the paper down to this little crevasse here and up to the top and over. And then go back and forth and just kind of smooth it out so it's all kind of even through there. Your paper probably should be bowing out now, buckling as it's starting to absorb that and do its work through the tensile language of how paper likes to work. And if we don't do anything now, it'll simply dry out to the paper stock again. But what we're going to do very quickly is now put a little pigment, a little bit brighter blue. So you can work with your existing wash and simply add to it some tones you may like. Make sure when you do the sky now, we're going to test this on some paper stock so you like the color and tone of it. That's probably too powerful. Neutralize that a bit. Bring in a bit of green to the side since it's reflecting and pulling up some of the greens around the actual center here. And then we have to add a lot of water to it so it's got enough pigment pull to it to go across the whole area. There we go. So we'll test this really quick. What that looks like. That looks like a nice sky tone. And now we're going to push the paint around, but I did sort of indicate some patches of clear white I'm going to leave for the clouds. So I'm going to push it around and try to stop it right at the edge of the clouds. Now, it'll still bleed into the cloud area, but those should hold the really white of the cloud as we kind of move through that. So maybe now with the medium bristled chisel point, we'll come back in with a nice wet wash and start stronger at the top. That'll be the depth and darkness of the blues will be stronger up above. And now as we move around the clouds, we'll just kind of lightly follow those forms of what are kind of lined out here that we see in the photograph here. And they can be any really shapes you like. We're just going to push them against the architecture a little bit. And as the clouds dissipate in the horizon, it's going to be the same size cloud relatively, but they're going to get smaller in shape for our sketch to show that distance. A little ribbon of blue there. And now the same cloud forms back here and cuts through. Let's see, I'll have this one tail down. Section of white clouds over in the corner there, and more sky blue over here. There we go. And now I'll come back before it sets up and dries too much and put a little bit more pigment at the top, because if the clouds weren't there, this whole thing would just be a sheet that goes from page white to a darker blue at the top. So we simply want to honor that and put a little bit more pigment towards the top of our sketch. This is back there. There. And the one thing you can do, kind of move that, which we haven't talked about yet with washes, because most of our stuff has been more tight and architectural, is you take your paper stock and simply tilt it. You can let the water work with gravity as well. So move that pigment, and over time now that will shift left and right how you play with the paper as it sets up. It'll still be in motion until 1 or 2 minutes from now where the water will stop moving. But even at 90 degrees, it'll force more of the tone to hit the top of the drawing. And if you're under real time constraint, it's not unheard of to work with the hair dryer so that you can expedite the drying process of your work. So we're going to let that set up because we're going to come back into the clouds and try to accentuate their form work by using some sort of blue, black, gray at the base of those, because the clouds themselves, they receive light, so they've got more brilliant areas, and they also have a shade side to them, which is always sort of that off blue gray, and we'll show at the bottom to make them a little more bulbous up in the sky. So the next round is to go back into our deeper values here and simply push in and get to probably 40%, 40 or 50% gray. With a little bit drier wash, meaning a little bit more paint to water ratio. And it could be a tad bluer if you want to enrich the colors of the painting here, the sketch painting. And I'll test this. It's okay. And now with the, again, just the pigment, if you want to dry out your brush first and then come back into the pool. We'll start over here on this side, and we're going to enhance this by saying that this is all photographically sort of the same tone at this distance, but we know in real life, the sun's going to come down and hit this area. This light actually then lights the underside of this, that the lower part of the building gets lighter and it becomes darker at the top there, the further away from the reflected light. So we want to gradate from the top and then have that come down. So maybe get it with a couple different strokes of pigment in there. And that'll help that move. We'll come down and do this plane the same way, because that pushes in a little bit deeper behind in there. This front plane faces this way, the western aspect. This is southern exposure, so that'll be more brilliant, but the back side right behind it is much deeper and darker with the columns. Zoom back on that side. And the behind this area is a part of the interior that's even further into the space and deeper away from sunlight and behind this piece. So that floor there is going to go much darker toward that space. We'll keep building that up over time to really push some depth back in that interior. Then we'll come to this little area here where this section of the plane eclipses this area. So as the light comes down and shows over that, there's a little ribbon of overplay of the overlap of the actual form where one slides under the other. So this goes much darker here between the two. And we'll take that same blue-black value and we'll come back in and start this process over. So we'll gradate, make it strongest at the top where it has great concentration, and then kind of fans out over here in the center of that area. You kind of put a shade within the shade, and it's crispest right where it leaves it and kind of dissipates out toward the plaza. Come back in and do that again here, and just repeat that 2 more times. Strongest at the top, strongest to the right, and kind of then fades out over here to the left within the planes of the architecture curving away. The building in 2014 won the Design Museum's Design of the Year award, making Zaha Hadid the first woman to win the top prize in the competition. There's a little bit of light that we're going to work on next stage. We're going to leave that in there. Again, that curls down and around. And now back here, farthest away from us, underneath the building, it's a series of rectilinear shapes, which will go darker and darker with each level of value we're adding here. So that starts to bring that out here. And I think it's time to probably go back to the clouds now so we can emphasize some of their qualities here. So what we probably want to do is take a little pool of the blue, the existing clouds and shadow, and then add just a little bit of black to it. So it ends up being more of a milky gray, maybe a little bit of white as well, kind of soften that up. And the idea there is to test that next to the white of the page. So if we have sky here, and then if we add a blue black that's got, again, a little bit of white in it associated with it, seems like it might be a little too dark now, but the idea is to cut that with water. So it looks like it might be the underside of a cloud adjacent to the cloud and the sky behind it. So it really is kind of subtle in the beginning. We can add to it here. So I'll just take my pool now and add some water to it, so I don't overcommit, and then try the underside of this one in the distance here. And that should sort of strengthen the notion of being a three-dimensional form up there. And then I'll use that underside to make this seem brighter next to it. So next pass through, I'll make the underside of that cloud strongest here, which will make this white pop off that background. And so you want the very top to be very crisp next to the sky behind it. So only shade on the underside of the cloud. So just kind of follow that rule and the others as well. Even if the paper is a little bit wet yet, it's nice to have that kind of dissipate off so it's not too lineal. Pull these around, make them kind of wispy. And now we'll shape these clouds. We're kind of laying on each other, or one cloud can actually cast a shadow on another. And again, to highlight this edge, we're going to bring this gray down and touch that edge, but we'll come back with a darker value towards our 70–80% to make that ring a little truer here. Because the darks on the clouds that are closest to us, the darks above aren't apparently that bright. But as they move away, miles away in the distance, those grays become a little bit thinner but darker in value because they're collapsing all that value onto itself. And then they can kind of break up into little wispy patterns that float away from the cloud too. And maybe take it all the way over the edge over here to a little more formation right by the edge of the building. We'll take that down to edge that corner. Okay, now we step up into our 70–80%. We go darker and darker. So we probably won't have to touch the sky again. We're simply going to highlight this whole 3-inch zone of the sketch to kind of pull out and make this volumetric really curl off the page for us. So introduce a little bit more of the black or a blue black if you've got a pad of that. Or mixing trail with a hint of green, because there's always a little bit as the atmosphere above blends all the lights it sees and bounces it around, that nothing's ever really like a true color palette. It's always a blend. And then we want a little bit more pigment here. Make it deeper, bolder. There we go. We're going to really layer in some tone at the top here. Deeper and darker, let that float down. Edge. Deeper at the top. And because it's got a brighter background, we'll come down the edge of this piece and have it come right to the point when that kind of throws its tooth in the earth there. And then from that point, this thing, if the light is coming down at a certain angle, it will obviously cast its own shadow down here. And so that can be a projection out from this form, landing that shadow in the front of it. But that's going to be, in a sense, a brighter shadow than the one that's inside here. That'll make us go darker here, particularly by that white edge on the other side, because that plane's getting lit up by this side, and it's not getting lit up on the back side. That undulates back. And same is true for the wall plane in there with the columns that are holding it up. That'll be darker towards the top where it meets the white shroud of the sort of undulating plane of concrete. We'll come to this ribbon that comes down. This should appeal to you as something that's wrapping down and going underneath it. When it comes over here, it's actually sliding behind another wall, so that'll be darker right at that edge. And to show some depth in here that we'll see into this space, but we'll see the lip of the architecture, and then it gets darker toward this one corner over here. We'll make that a little bit bolder. Come back to our side and get it a little bit drier, a little more paint. And come to the right edge of these three pieces now, rather than the whole piece, and really pull out that little ribbon. What actually is our first little view of looking inside the space. It gets that dark, so we'll bring in more black later for these zones. And that curls down and lose that sense, because that'll pull us in to the interior. Do the same over here. We're going to see a little bit more, so that space of actual opening is a little bit broader than the first one we did. And then comes down to grade and basically comes down right about here. That's where the interior architecture ends, and it's sealed off for the internal environment. And now at the top here, that lips around in there, and then comes down to this point. Down. And then the underside. Back into these zones, gets washed out. Now we're going to come back as we step through this to a very thin line work of the first tier of steps. So the first major one starts thin in the distance, and then that little rise there, which is the play of these things moving out in space, gets broader and broader as it comes in the foreground to us. So just thicken that up as it moves closer to us. And we'll do it again over here. Starts as just the line drawn in from projecting, trace the image to a certain thickness that shows the rise in the material. And that change of scale, knowing it's the exact same material, helps the depth as it recedes away from us. Do it one more time here. I think we'd probably use a finer brush after this. So this is the last one we probably use this for. Over on the right to fill that in. So we get that sequence and cadence of actually moving up and away. Yeah, now we're mixing our last little piece. So we'll be almost done here. Come back in with a zone. It's just basically a little residual pool of that tone, and maybe sap out some of the water, leaving just the color there, and then add just some black to it. And then we squeegee out the water, just use the tip of the brush with the black. And now we're going to come into really key zones. You want to go as dark as possible in the sketch. So right where this comes down to this point, I'm going to bring that black down and raise it up, and then edge it next to the white front. And then let the water take it away and bleed off. And right after this corner top here, introduce that black over the existing blue. Make that have some movement of light, shade, and shadow within that tone there. Don't make any one plane ever, it's just sort of monolithic. And then probably to also show this plane move up as it gets further away from this corner, it's going to have more of the darks laden in it. So I'm going to take that up to that edge of the white. And then down to the interior wall of the entry, which again is receiving more light. The glazing for it kind of reflects the underside, so it's more brilliant. But once you're inside then the space, we see through to something in there that'll be a much darker plane. Even if it could be a white wall in there, it's still going to read dark. over on this side to show space. And then we get that little glimpse of the plaza on the other side, and then right through the base of the room coming here, which means we see light, but we're only going to see the columns of the interior support there as dark planes. And then push some dark back in here, all the way adjacent to that. Right. Take that nice blue black into our existing areas and push them to the corner. Highlight the very edge with the black here, right where the line meets the outside skin. Where the line meets the outside skin, we're simply going to push it with black now. And finally over here as well. Up to the top and down. You can make your own judgment if you want to do more to finish it up. Depends on how it reads for you now and what you've done on the earlier washes. And if you want to sort of give scale to this, as people generate the size, because right now there's not a whole lot of scale. It might be an idea that might be one story, but you don't know until you actually put a human being next to it. So let's go on the plaza sort of right in the center here. And so at this level, since we're kind of up looking down on the plaza a little bit, we won't put the person out below us at head height. So we're going to have a figure here with a torso and then their legs. And obviously people going to these centers probably come in groups. So there's another person adjacent to them. And we'll put one or two a little bit larger because they're closer to us here, a little bit smaller because they're further away from us there. And we'll give the least little bit of value to their torsos here. Just enough to fill up some idea of tone. And it's the simplest little line for the feet. And then if it's too ponded with water, just scrape the water out of your bristles and they'll absorb like a sponge and take the water out. So you're just left with pigment. And now the people are in and sort of as silhouettes for scale there, they're also going to have a shadow cast from them as well because they're vertical features in the sun's realm. So we'll take that and we'll drop in a dry cut shadow. If the sun is like it seems directly behind the way we're looking at it, it might kick out a shadow like that towards the center itself, which lands the person more on the firm ground itself here in terms of their scale then. This is the last of the series of modern masters from the dawn of the 20th century to the dawn of the 21st century, from Frank Lloyd Wright to Zaha Hadid. So if we work back in time, Frank Gehry, Mies van der Rohe, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Le Corbusier, Garrett Rietveld, Walter Gropius, Frank Lloyd Wright, and where we started 10 sessions ago, Frank Lloyd Wright at the Darwin Martin House.